Disclaimer: the following story is a work of fiction based on the general concept of Iranian Ghoul folklore. It is intended for mature audiences and may contain disturbing content. The desert wind howled like a wounded beast, whipping sand into angry, stinging particles. Aafia clutched her children closer, their small bodies trembling against the relentless onslaught. Arish, her husband, was at the wheel, his face etched with a grim determination that belied the terror in his eyes. They were fleeing something that lurked in the shadows, something ancient and hungry. It had started innocently enough, a strange, almost ethereal glow emanating from the old, forgotten well in their backyard. Curiosity, a dangerous mistress, had prompted Arish to investigate. What he found was a darkness so profound it seemed to seep into the very marrow of his bones. An ancient forgotten evil had been disturbed. Aafia remembered the night vividly. The house had been filled with an icy dread. Shadows danced in the corners, taking on grotesque shapes. The children, Aben and Afreen, had woken, their small faces contorted in terror. Then she had heard it. A low, guttural growl that echoed through the house. The Ghoul, they called it. A creature of shadow and hunger. A relic of a time when the world was young and dark magic held sway. It was said to be a shapeshifter, able to mimic human form to lure its prey. It was said to be immortal, its existence a grotesque mockery of life. Arish had recognized the signs immediately. The glowing well, the unnatural cold, the shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. It was a ghoul without a doubt. They had to flee. Now, as they hurtled across the desert, the sky was a canvas of angry reds and oranges. The sun, a malevolent eye, watched their desperate flight. Aafia glanced back. The darkness seemed to be closing in, a black tide creeping across the horizon. Faster, Arish, she screamed, her voice a hoarse whisper in the wind. But the car, battered and weary, could only push so hard. As the night descended, the desert transformed into a monster. The sand dunes became undulating waves of darkness, the wind a banshee's wail. The children were silent, their fear palpable. Aafia held them close, their bodies trembling like leaves in a storm. Then it happened. A screech, a sound that curdled blood, split the night. The car lurched violently as something, or someone, struck it from behind. Arish fought to maintain control, but the car spun out of control, tumbling end over end. When Aafia regained consciousness, she was alone. The car was a twisted, mangled wreck. The children were gone. A cold dread seeped into her soul. The Ghoul had found them. She crawled out of the wreckage, her body screaming in pain. The desert stretched out before her, a vast, indifferent expanse. She could hear the wind, a mournful dirge for the lost. And then she heard it, a whisper, a promise of unspeakable horror. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. In the distance, a figure stood silhouetted against the moonlit sky, tall, gaunt, with eyes that burned like embers in the darkness. It was the Ghoul. Terror consumed her. She wanted to run, to hide, but her legs refused to obey. The Ghoul moved towards her, its gait slow and deliberate. With each step, Aafia felt a cold hand closing around her heart. As the Ghoul drew closer, she saw its face, or rather, what was left of its face. A mask of skin stretched taut over a skull-like structure. Its eyes, black pits devoid of any human emotion, wore into her soul. A scream built in her throat, a desperate plea for mercy, but no sound escaped her lips. The Ghoul was upon her, and then darkness. When Aafia awoke, she was in a hospital bed. A doctor, a kind-faced man with gentle hands, was hovering over her. He told her she had been found unconscious in the desert, miraculously alive. But Aafia knew the truth. She had survived, but at what cost? Her children were gone, forever lost to the darkness. And the Ghoul, it was still out there, waiting, hungry. She was a survivor, yes, but she was also a prisoner of fear. The desert wind, once a comforting companion, now carried the echoes of her nightmares. The shadows in the corners of her room were no longer harmless illusions. They were reminders of the horror she had escaped. Aafia lived, but a part of her died in that desert. The Ghoul had taken more than her children. It had taken her innocence, her peace of mind. She was a survivor, but she was also a haunted woman. Forever marked by the night, she faced the face of evil. The hospital room was a sterile cocoon, a stark contrast to the hell she'd escaped. Aafia lay in the bed, a ghost in a white gown. The beeping of machines was a constant, irritating rhythm that pulsed through her head. She was alive, but her spirit was trapped in a desolate wasteland. Nightmares consumed her. The desert, vast and unforgiving, stretched out before her in vivid detail. The wind howled, carrying with it the mournful cries of her children. The Ghoul, a monstrous shadow, stalked her, its eyes burning holes in her dreams. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. The doctors were baffled by her rapid recovery. Her physical wounds were healing at an astonishing rate, almost as if her body was fighting against something more than just physical damage. They suggested therapy, but the idea of talking about her ordeal seemed impossible. Words were inadequate to describe the horror she had witnessed. As the days turned into weeks, Aafia began to see things. Shadows that moved on their own, whispers carried on the wind, a cold touch on her skin when no one was near. The doctors chalked it up to stress, but Aafia knew better. The Ghoul was still with her, a specter haunting her every waking moment. One night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she heard a soft scratching sound. It came from the wall, a persistent rhythm that grew louder with each passing moment. Fear gripped her heart. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just the wind, but the sound was too clear, too deliberate. With trembling hands, she pulled herself out of bed and approached the wall. As she drew closer, the scratching intensified. Her breath caught in her throat as she pressed her ear against the cold plaster. A faint, high-pitched whimper escaped her lips. Suddenly, the wall seemed to bulge outward. A crack appeared, and then, with a sickening crunch, it shattered. A dark, gaping hole emerged, revealing a blackness that seemed to pull her in. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed an unnatural red. The Ghoul. Terror consumed her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. The Ghoul stood there, silent, its gaze fixed on her. Then it spoke. "You survived." Its voice was a rasping whisper, "But your time is coming." And with that, it vanished back into the wall, leaving behind a chilling silence. Aafia collapsed to the floor, her mind racing. The Ghoul was in her house. It was hunting her, and she was alone, a terrified prey in the jaws of a monstrous predator. The nightmare was far from over. The hole in the wall was a gaping wound in the fabric of reality, a portal to a realm of shadow and terror. Aafia stood frozen, her mind a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. The creature, the Ghoul, had breached her sanctuary. It was no longer a creature of the desert, a distant nightmare. It was here, in her home, in her world. Days turned into a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. She barricaded herself in, transforming her home into a fortress. Every shadow was a potential threat, every creak and groan a harbinger of doom. Sleep was a luxury she could no longer afford. The Ghoul's promise echoed in her mind. "Your time is coming." She reached out to friends, to family. But who would believe her story? A creature of myth, a Ghoul, living in her walls. They would think she was mad. So, she retreated into isolation, a prisoner in her own home. Desperation gnawed at her. She needed help, but she didn't know who to turn to. The police, they would laugh in her face. The church, They would offer prayers, but no protection. She was alone, truly alone. Then, a glimmer of hope. In the depths of her despair, she remembered an old, forgotten book she had found in her father's library. It was a book of ancient Persian lore, filled with tales of magic and monsters. Perhaps, just perhaps, it held the key to defeating the Ghoul. With trembling hands, she found the book. Its pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded and blurred. But the words, written in a script she barely understood, held a promise of hope. There were tales of brave warriors who had faced creatures of darkness, of ancient rituals and powerful artifacts. One passage stood out. It spoke of a stone, a heartstone, said to be the heart of the earth. It was said to repel evil, to protect against the darkness. The stone was hidden, its location a secret passed down through generations. A spark ignited within Aafia, hope, a fragile flame in the darkness. She would find the heartstone. She would protect herself, and perhaps, just perhaps, she could save others from the Ghoul's terror. The hunt began. She spent countless hours poring over ancient maps, deciphering cryptic clues. The trail led her to remote villages, to forgotten ruins, to the heart of the desert. With each step, the danger grew, but so did her determination. The heartstone was her only hope, and she would find it, no matter the cost. The desert stretched out before Aafia, a vast, unforgiving expanse. The sun beat down mercilessly, a fiery crucible testing her endurance. She carried a worn leather satchel, filled with maps, water, and a few essential supplies. Her journey had taken her far from the familiar, into a world of sand and silence. The old book offered cryptic clues: a mountain of red stone, a hidden valley, a star aligned with the moon. It was a puzzle, a riddle that tested her sanity. She had deciphered enough to pinpoint a general region, but the exact location remained elusive. Days turned into weeks. She encountered mirages, storms, and creatures of the desert. Each night, under the vast, indifferent sky, she studied the stars, searching for the alignment described in the book. Loneliness was her constant companion, a cold, gnawing emptiness. One evening, as the desert sky transformed into a canvas of fiery hues, she saw it. The alignment, a star, a perfect diamond in the twilight, was positioned exactly as the book described. A surge of hope coursed through her veins. She followed the star, its light a beacon in the darkness. The terrain changed. Sand gave way to rock, and the horizon was punctuated by jagged peaks. As she climbed higher, the air grew thin, and the wind howled like a banshee. At the summit, she found it, a mountain of red stone, as the book had promised. Its slopes were sheer, its peak shrouded in mist. There was no obvious path, no sign of human presence. But Aafia was determined. She began the ascent, her body aching, her lungs burning. The higher she climbed, the more intense the cold became. The wind whipped at her, trying to force her back, but she pressed on, driven by a force beyond her understanding. Finally, she reached the peak. The world below was a breathtaking panorama of sand and sky, but it was not the view that captivated her attention. In a small, sheltered alcove, nestled in the heart of the red stone, she found it, the Heartstone. It was a sphere of pure crystalline energy, pulsing with an inner light. As she reached out to touch it, a warmth spread through her body, a sense of peace and protection. She had found it. The Heartstone was hers. But as she reached out to claim her prize, the ground beneath her began to tremble. The mountain roared to life, cracks spreading across its surface. A darkness, a shadow, emerged from within the heart of the stone. It was the Ghoul, a monstrous, shadowy figure, its eyes burning with hatred. The battle for the Heartstone had begun.